Hi everybody, I'm Richard Carrick. I'm a composer, conductor, and pianist. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today. I'd like to speak with you about something called visualizing music. It's the title of a portrait concert I recently had at MIT. And I thought it would be a nice framework to discuss some of my recent works, specifically those that incorporate dance, those that incorporate video and moving image, as well as my graphic scores. I hope you enjoy this, and I look forward to sharing these works with you today. My music for dance culminates in a large work entitled C, which is in collaboration with choreographer Miro Magloire and the New Chamber Ballet. Miro and I met about 10 years ago at the premiere of my Flow Cycle for strings, and we kept in touch for a number of years. After a few years, we decided to collaborate. In about 2015, he approached me and asked if he could choreograph my piece in Flow, which is for solo violin. I was excited about this, and little did I know it at the time, but this was actually the beginning of a multi-year collaboration that would end in the hour-long piece, C. Due to a number of factors, in 2015 I was living in Rwanda without reliable internet, and then instead of moving back to New York, I moved to Boston. Our collaboration was a little different. We collaborated by discussing art and a mutual appreciation for each other's work, rather than in-person collaboration. And remember, this is pre-pandemic times when most collaborations were done in person, in apartments, in cafes, and after concerts. Our next collaboration, which is called A Travelogue of Haunting Places, is a set of 5 piano preludes that I wrote based on particular experiences I had when visiting Mediterranean towns. In particular, Gaudi's Barcelona, the medieval castle at Egmont, and the Roman ruins in Arles. Working with the miniature form of the preludes offers some nice possibilities that lend themselves well to dance. For example, nimble and quick-moving music, as well as more soundscape music that's devoid of pitch and rhythm entirely. There's a world of piano when you play on the traditional keyboard, and there's a whole other world when you play standing up inside the piano. And as a longtime performer of both traditional avant-garde and experimental piano music, I felt like this was the right time to blend these two traditions into a set of ultimately 12 piano preludes that explore the richness and all the possibilities the piano has to offer. For example, in Egmont, the piano prelude, the powerful opening chords represent the ancient grandeur of this castle, whereas the low, rumbling, overtone cascading sounds, a much less traditional technique, represents the ancient spirits rising from this castle. this second collaboration, Miro and I realized we should combine these two pieces to create an evening-length work. And it was actually one of the silver linings of the pandemic was you ended up working on the project for like a year and a half instead of a few months.
Yeah.
And I feel like there was such depth that you brought to the dance and somehow captured everything that was happening, because it's three different pieces. But in the third, the first piece was music that I wrote before and you set, but then the preludes were really written with this idea in mind that you were going to set them to dance. And then the final piece, when it all came together, I feel like you captured something about movement, musical movement and physical movement, that it beautifully counterpoints throughout the whole project.
I think what's nice is that there's, cross references between the pieces musically that then makes it easy, even though they were written in some cases, years apart. It makes it easy then to have an evening, I think the piece is an hour long without intermission. You hear things that remind you of something that you've heard 40 minutes ago. And I think that's a very rich environment in which to choreograph, because then you can do the same choreographically. You can have this idea of how do you shape an hour long of somebody's attention that is watching this and listening to it. What is the moment when they need to encounter something familiar? What's the moment when they maybe just need to tune out? So you put something that's a little more boring. Choreographically, maybe people should just listen here. I'm not going to do anything interesting. Right. And then 5 minutes later, you try to get them back involved and engaged by being more physical. So I was excited about how music and dance were interacting in different layers outside of rhythm and time. Synchronicity here is not the goal. There are untouchable metaphors here in the physical gestures as well as the musical gestures that create an underlying unity throughout the work. There are also formal relationships that tap into memory and memory recall in a very interesting way. The final collaboration is a 30-minute work entitled The Mill for violin and piano, which is based on Korean traditional gugak pansori melody. After numerous visits to Korea, I became fascinated with and studied Korean gugak music, and also had the honor of performing with many great gugak musicians. The music is unique and expressive, and the instruments use such creative techniques to create their original sounds. Although the music is traditional and ancient, it sounds like some of the most extreme contemporary music I've ever heard. The opening 7-minute piece of The Mill starts off with this Korean pansori melody played in the violin and bell-like chords coming out of the piano. As the violin melody repeats itself, it slows down its rhythmic values until it becomes very slow-moving, soaring high notes. Whereas those bell-like chords, which were very much in the background, get filled in with lots of rich other notes, creating this really flow-like quality in the piano which overtakes the violin.
visually dominated culture. So when I write music for musicians and image, I'm always thinking about how to enrich the musical experience. So one of the things I do is think about counterpoint between the music that we hear and the images that we see. It's also very important to take into account the physical presence of the musicians as part of this experience. It's important to note that this is not film music. This is a musical performance with moving images as part of that experience. Prisoner Cinema is a work I wrote for large ensemble and video. It references an experience, an unnatural experience, where people who have been deprived of light for days or even weeks at a time report that during this time they would have flashes of images come before them. Distorted images, but still images nonetheless. I decided to reimagine this somehow into a musical experience where music exists, and from the music there'd be occasional flashes of images that come out. So when you see this piece, the first few minutes, it's all music with a blank screen. As the images start to flash on the screen, they do eventually take over at one point and the music drops out. And when they take over, they're always still images, and they're never quite the same image, but they become a sequence of images. Rwandan Images, which is written for live cellists, pre-recorded cello and bird sounds, and pre-recorded video, is a collaboration I did with the cellist Dan Weinstein in Tel Aviv. Having shot interesting footage of water in Rwanda, I decided to have a three-way counterpoint between this moving image, the live cellist, and the pre-recorded sounds. So at any point in the piece, one of these three strands would be leading and pushing the music forward, much in the same way that water also moves in 3 dimensions. To enhance this flow, we decided to put Dan right in front center, in front of the large projected image of the water. So he would be surrounded by the water throughout the performance. as a performer, I've performed graphic scores for many years. But as a composer, I didn't write my first graphic score until 2017, when I was invited by Iancu Dumitrescu and Ana Maria Avram to Bucharest to perform in the Ionescu Festival with their ensemble, the Hyperion Ensemble. I first worked with them in 2016 in New York City with my ensemble Either Or, when we did a 3-day portrait festival of their music at Miller Theater. And this was the first time I experienced their working method, which I found fascinating. They introduced me to the composer-conductor, where the composer is on stage conducting the music in real time, shaping things, deciding on duration, sounds, entrances, number of repeats, in a way that was much more freeing and expansive than I was able to do with completely notated music. They also showed me incredible rehearsal strategies for sculpting really particular sounds in rehearsal based on those particular players you have in the room. But then when you get to the performance, you can shape them and expand them in many different ways. I was really excited about this way of working, and I wanted to see if I could bring some of these methods into the music I was writing at the time. About a year later, I started working on what's since become the graphic series Lead Sheets. These are 50-plus scores written for improvising musicians, from solo works, chamber works, as well as large ensemble works. These works can be played on their own, or they can also be played simultaneously with other graphic scores, as well as with the piano preludes. I think of them as lead sheets for new music improvisers. As you know, lead sheets are a common way to notate jazz and popular music, where certain aspects of the music are specified, melody, chords, and the form, and other aspects are up to the performer, instrumentation, arrangement, chord substitutions, and the like. I wanted that level of freedom and structure in my score, so I used graphic notation this time, and my graphic scores specify a few very important things, such as form, such as sync points between instruments, and general musical behavior. But they also leave a lot of things free: instrumentation, sounds, pitch, and things that the performer can bring in are all left to the interpreter. For many people who use graphic scores, they use graphics to represent a particular sound. In my scores, although they should represent when you make a sound, I'm more interested in how the graphics interact with each other, and specifically how do musicians interact with each other. So especially in my chamber pieces, I'm looking to create that chamber music intensity that you hear in great notated works, but in a graphic music environment. I developed these scores for about a year, really off the radar. I developed them with my student group Neither Nor at Berkeley, and with a few close collaborators that are in Either Or, my professional ensemble in New York, as well as some other players. It wasn't until the end of 2019 that the violinist Lauren Cawley approached me and asked me to write a piece for her upcoming concert at Miller Theater. She was giving a pop-up concert and wanted a new graphic score for me. This was my first commission as a graphic score, and we decided to do this project together.
What was the process like for learning a graphic score, and this graphic score in particular?
Yeah, I mean, learning this graphic score was actually very different than my experience learning other graphic scores. So that's probably the first thing I'll say. Previously, when I had played graphic scores, I had done like just kind of reacted on instinct to whatever I was seeing. And when I got your score, there was so much detail in it that I felt I had to like dissect it in a different way. So I really took like a lot of time to figure out there are all these different signs, but it was up in the air what they signified. So I kind of was left to figure out what I could do with each sound, what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to be consistent. And there were, unlike previous scores that I played, there's color involved. So it kind of like made me have to have this like synesthetic experience, because you're bringing in this other element that traditionally you don't see in music notation, or Western notation at least. Yeah, so it was really fun. I mean, the sort of elements that I was always considering were shape, color, size, where they laid on this like imaginary axis, and how they related before and after to whatever came with them.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a really fun process for me.
Well, so one thing I notice is, that level of detail really came through in your performance. And when I first heard you play it, it was like a bulldozer of sounds coming off of the page, because everything that was written was I mean, you could hear it 100%. It was really incredible. I was
Cool.
kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about what the experience was like for you as an interpreter, and what did it do differently for you, in terms of like, how did you feel about the process and so forth?
Yeah, I found it very rewarding to work on. It was like very like sandbox like. So like unlike other pieces where I kind of I have a method for learning music and polishing it and perfecting it. This was very different, because I could maybe find a sound that I liked for this like red sharp shape, but then I found myself thinking, what other ways could I play that? Like, what ways am I not thinking of? Is this shape sounding different enough from this other shape? So it was kind of like this very exploratory process. It's also like you can really go down a rabbit hole with any of these little details. It was also really fun because I found myself zooming in really far and like waiting until it like spit me back out. And then I was like, okay, I have to stop, I'm gonna go with that sound, um, and then go back to this context always.
Well, we started this presentation with the framework of visualizing music. So I hope that these examples give you a better understanding of my compositional output and interests. I'm continuing to develop these and actually combining them in new ways. We're now in the post or current pandemic mode, so I'm looking for new ways to always bring this together to create a really unique experience for the listener and the viewer. So thank you again.